American trucks have always been a category of their own. Long-nosed machines with what was almost a one-room apartment behind the cab, simple and reliable engineering, and an entire subculture built around them. These trucks were designed for the endless highways of the United States and Canada, and later became widely used in Australia. In Europe, however, they remained virtually unknown because they were the exact opposite of what European transport companies needed. A European truck regularly has to enter tight warehouses, terminals, urban industrial zones, ferries, old streets, and loading areas with very limited space. It is almost impossible to imagine an American truck in that role. That is why European manufacturers place the cab above the engine, making the tractor as short and maneuverable as possible while leaving more room for the trailer. However, from the late 1990s, and especially during the 2000s, American trucks became remarkably popular across the former Soviet Union. This seemed paradoxical. Despite decades behind the Iron Curtain, trucks in this region had been designed according to the same basic principles as their European counterparts. But once the market opened, local transport companies unexpectedly discovered that American trucks were almost perfectly suited to local conditions and the kind of work they had to do. The trend became so significant that even the Minsk automobile plant, one of the leading heavy truck manufacturers in the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet region, decided to offer transport companies a Belarusian version of an American truck. In this video, we will find out what MAZ ultimately created and why this unusual truck never reached mass production. After 1991, a flood of used cars from Europe entered the countries of the former Soviet Union. But trucks were a different story. The long-distance and international transport industry was in terrible shape, and most carriers were either former state-owned companies with outdated equipment or small private operators with very little capital. During the first half of the 1990s, imported trucks were simply out of reach. Freight was carried by anything that could still move. Four-wheel drive Ural trucks and slow gas models were used for long-distance work, while private operators added homemade sleeping compartments to old trucks and adapted them to whatever jobs they could find. The situation began to change by the late 1990s, and especially in the early 2000s. The economy was recovering, trade and freight volumes were growing, and private transport companies were appearing. Old MAZ and KAMAZ trucks were becoming less attractive, but new European tractors were still too expensive, while leasing and financing remained poorly developed. Used trucks then began arriving from Europe and the United States. American trucks initially looked exotic, but it quickly became clear that they were almost perfectly suited to local conditions. Large American fleets worked their tractors hard and often sold them after just 4 or 5 years at relatively low prices. As a result, the former Soviet Union mostly received not expensive custom Kenworths covered in chrome, but mass-produced Freightliner and international trucks with plenty of useful life remaining. For a relatively modest price, a carrier could get a powerful tractor with a reliable engine, a simple manual transmission, 2 driven axles, and large fuel tanks. But one of the biggest advantages was the spacious sleeper. Roadside motels in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus at the time mostly existed in American movies, so drivers often had to sleep in the cab. Formal limits on the overall length of a tractor-trailer combination were not a major obstacle either, because enforcement was often weaker than in Western Europe. Carriers could retain full cargo capacity while gaining a huge sleeper compartment and easy access to the engine. Even shipping the truck across the ocean did not make the purchase uneconomical. The difference between transporting an American truck by sea and driving a used European truck overland was not large enough to discourage buyers. MAZ survived the 1990s better than many other post-Soviet vehicle manufacturers. And this was not because the company quickly adapted to a market economy. In fact, it was almost the opposite. Belarus did not abandon the Soviet industrial model as radically as Russia and Ukraine, which allowed the factory to preserve production and eventually return to growth. During the first years, however, MAZ still balanced on the edge of survival. The single market disappeared, supply chains collapsed, state-owned transport companies almost stopped buying new vehicles, and truck production fell sharply. But the factory was not privatized, broken up, or left to survive on its own. It remained a large state-owned enterprise, supported by low-interest loans and government orders. The restoration of trade with Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet republics also brought back its main export markets. Its preserved production base also helped. In the early 1990s, MAZ completed a new truck assembly line that had been started during the Soviet era. The factory still had enormous production capacity, an experienced engineering team, and an almost completed new generation of trucks. In 1993, the experimental MAZ 5440 appeared, and in 1997, production of the new long-haul tractors began. Instead of developing completely new trucks, MAZ focused on gradually modernizing a familiar and relatively inexpensive design. More modern engines, transmissions, and cabs were added over time. The MAZ-MAN joint venture, established in the late 1990s, gave the factory access to German components and technology without requiring a complete overhaul of production. By the early 2000s, MAZ was no longer simply surviving. It had secured a strong market position. Its trucks were considerably cheaper than Western models and better suited to long-haul work than most local competitors. The factory increased production, updated its model range, and was traditionally regarded more highly in this segment than KAMAZ. That made the decision taken in 2010 even more unexpected. MAZ management chose to move away from its familiar strategy of gradual modernization and create its own long-nose highway tractor. American long-nose tractors had already proven that there was demand for such vehicles in the post-Soviet market. In Minsk, they believed they could offer transport companies a similar truck, but one with a more familiar design that would also be easier to maintain. The project moved quickly. In the spring of 2011, MAZ unveiled the first long-nose highway tractor in its modern history, the MAZ 6440RA. The development budget was strictly limited, so the new truck shared as many components as possible with existing production models. It was built on a strong steel frame with side rails 280 millimeters high and 8 millimeters thick. The axles came from the MAZ 6430. For the first time in the factory's history, air suspension was fitted not only at the rear, but also on the front axle. The pressure in the individual air springs could also be adjusted independently. The cab was also taken from the production MAZ 6430, but it was mounted behind the front axle and received a substantially redesigned interior. In front of it sat an 18-liter V8 MMZ D283 diesel engine producing 600 horsepower. It was paired with an imported 6-speed Allison 4500R automatic transmission. The engine was covered by a plastic hood that tilted forward as a single unit, providing easy access for maintenance. The truck looked surprisingly good from the outside, while the interior offered a level of comfort never before seen in a production MAZ. The driver's seat, supplied by the German company ISRI, featured air suspension and numerous adjustments. The unique dashboard was also angled toward the driver. The prototype was equipped with power windows, an electrically operated roof hatch, cruise control, air conditioning, heated mirrors, ESP and ABS, a liquid-cooled engine preheater, a refrigerator, an audio system, and a digital tachograph. The cab contained 2 bunks, while the fuel tanks held 1,000 liters of diesel. Its projected top speed was 134 kilometers per hour, although the electronic limiter restricted it to 89. The technically permitted gross combination weight was 63 tons, while payload capacity reached 44.7 tons. However, the long-nose MAZ had one important difference from a true American truck: its sleeper compartment. Because the cab came from the standard MAZ 6430, its rear section remained almost unchanged. As a result, the first long-nose MAZ fell well behind American trucks in what was arguably their greatest advantage. That is why Minsk prepared a second version in 2012. Its wheelbase was extended, the cab was made considerably longer, and a proper living compartment appeared behind the seats. It offered larger sleeping areas, a flat floor, and improved interior trim. For the next several years, the MAZ 6440RA was displayed at exhibitions, where the unusual truck from Minsk consistently attracted considerable attention. But actual transport companies showed little interest in buying it. The problem was that The Minsk automobile plant had arrived too late with its answer to American trucks. Imports of American tractors peaked between 2003 and 2008, but after the global financial crisis, they almost came to a halt. New import duties and stricter emissions requirements made older trucks more difficult to bring in, while newer American models had become too expensive. At the same time, the market itself had changed. By the early 2010s, European tractors had become the more economical choice for most carriers. They were lighter, more fuel efficient, better supported by service networks and spare parts, and most importantly, suitable for both domestic and international transport. American long-nosed trucks were less compatible with European length restrictions, emissions standards, and road charges. American trucks had not yet disappeared from the roads of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but the fleet was barely being renewed. They remained popular longest in Siberia, the Urals, and the Russian Far East, where strong construction, two-driven axles, large fuel tanks, and spacious sleepers were especially valuable. Even there, however, carriers were reluctant to take a chance on an unproven Belarusian long-nosed truck. Freightliner and International were already well known to drivers and mechanics, with established supplies of used parts, spare components, and years of repair experience. The MAZ 6440RA, by contrast, was a completely new and unfamiliar machine. The result was almost paradoxical. MAZ chose to create an answer to American trucks just as the market for them was beginning to disappear. There were still many on the road, but the number of potential buyers was shrinking, while long-haul transport was moving almost entirely toward European cab-over tractors. Still, competing with used American trucks was probably not the project's only purpose. By 2010, the MAZ model range was beginning to age, and the factory needed a striking flagship to show that it could build not only relatively inexpensive work trucks, but also impressive 600 horsepower tractors with a high level of comfort. But exhibition interest never turned into real orders. Unable to find buyers, MAZ soon ended the project and never returned to a long-nose layout.